Looking forward to sharing with you this morning. So you're not off the hook. There's one more handout on your table. So make sure you grab that and get a pencil or a pen there, and we'll try to get the blanks filled in. It's been a pleasure to be here and share with you. What I'm going to share this morning, I realize because of the age of the group, may not apply to some of you. You may have lived through and done the opposite of anything I'm going to say. And so I recognize that this could be hard for some of you, but let me say to you, you have children and grandchildren that need to hear and apply the truth of what I'm going to talk about this morning. And so maybe you didn't do it like this and you've got some regrets or whatever. I apologize for that, but what I'm going to share with you is what comes from, like Scott said, working with people for over 30 years. I began to observe some things. And what I want to share with you is a clear understanding of that diagram at the top of your page there. Basically, what I began to observe as I worked with people is they would have amassed all this financial capital, and they'd be sitting in my office with a $10 or $20 million estate with tears streaming down their face because they were telling me the sad stories of not knowing their children or losing a marriage or whatever. And so I began to put all this together, and the diagram you have in front of you was the outgrowth of that. And basically what it says is that you've got these issues of balance on the left. Does anybody here have a problem with balance? Anybody have a problem with balance, or maybe in the past life you did have a problem with balance? I think if we're all honest, balance is an elusive thing. So we're trying to balance life. We want to get to the end of our life and have no regrets. But the challenge is, on that left diagram, which two things are the hardest to balance? If we're honest, if we look at that diagram. Work and family. I heard it right down here. Work and family are the hardest to balance. You maybe haven't thought about why that is, but here's why it is. They both require the most time at the same time. Now, I've been trying to share truth with you over this weekend, and that's what I'm going to do this morning, share with you some truth about this whole area of money and where it fits in the context of our life. But we start our family, we start our career, we start building the business, like Don said the other night in 1982, you start your business or whatever. And they both require the same time. When you finally get the money in the big house, you don't need it. And when you needed it, you didn't have it. It all seems backwards, doesn't it? And so we get to the end of our life, and if we haven't been careful to balance life, we'll get to the end of our life and maybe have built financial capital at the exclusion of building spiritual and social capital into those who come after us and are what really matters. Socrates says, "What mean you fellow citizens? You turn every stone to scrape wealth together, and take so little care of your children, to whom one day will relinquish it all." So here's the big idea. The reason you have to deal with your money, the reason the middle part of that diagram, which I unpacked on Friday morning and told you some truth about it, the reason you have to deal with your money is not to have more money. The reason you have to deal with your money is to have more life. And to have some hope of getting balance so you don't get to the end of your life and have any regrets. Help your children and grandchildren understand this. You know, I'm glad I began to understand this early on because God allowed me to sit with these wealthy individuals that had built only financial capital. And I was there. When I started in the business, my thought of an investment was simply financial instruments, stocks, bonds, real estate, IRAs, and so forth. But you can invest in social and spiritual capital. Taking your children on a mission trip, that's a spiritual capital investment. Teaching your children how to work, that's a social capital investment. The best way to teach your children to have social capital, to be effective in society, is to teach them how to work. If you look on the back of that, you don't have, some of you are thinking, how am I going to write all this in those three little lines, okay? So just turn the sheet over. You don't have to write in the definitions, but on the back, you see the definitions of social, spiritual, and financial capital. And the big idea is you live your life and you have margin to invest. Don't just automatically default to financial instruments. Think about, how can I invest this in my children? Julie and I took a trip to Colorado years ago to a Young Life family camp, and you may say, Russ, that's an extravagant vacation. We looked at it as a spiritual capital investment. It was a vacation with a purpose. And I used to not think like this, investing money. Here's one the wives always like, when the kids were young, come November, December, I would pay for house help to give Julie some breathing room in that very hectic time. Instead of just being a living expense, that was an investment in our marriage. So I would just encourage you and encourage your children and grandchildren that when you have money, don't just think financial capital instruments, think spiritual and social capital investments. And the reason we're trying to balance life is we're trying to slow down the pace. Richard Swinson, in his book Margin, says we need room to breathe, we need freedom to think. We don't have time to listen, let alone love. And our relationships are being starved to death by velocity, and our children lay wounded on the ground, run over by high-speed good intentions. See, you want to manage your money to get control of your life. I received a letter years ago from a guy, and I'll just read a little excerpt of this to help you understand that you've got to deal with it. I want to take a moment to say a few things to you as you think about my wife and I while you're on vacation. Last night was another semi-sleepless night for me. They come more and more frequently of late. It's hard to put into words, but I need to try so you understand me better as you work with me. I'm seeing some things this past month I don't like. I guess they've always been there or nearby, but now I see them a little better. Between our meeting together and the book on Margin, I have a better handle on what is happening in my life. I've never really gripped the cost of day-to-day living. I sweep things like clothes, gasoline, dentist, breaks, and gifts into a little pile called incidentals. While it's a little pile called incidentals, it's a big pile called essentials. Not only is the pile large, the category is wrong, and I see that now and I want to fix it. Now catch this. I have no margin. I'm missing the little things of late with my kids. I'm irritable with my wife. I am discontent and not creative. In just 20 months, I've started a new business and I hate where I am. I have increased equity and decreased flexibility. And I see that in my giving, and that is the most painful part of all. Not only is my spending up, I feel it's very much self-centered. I will not live like this. How did this happen? Now, here's what I want you to hear. It's not from overwork, overplay, secret sin, or pursuit of power. It came in through my financial window. I see it so clearly now, and it's frightening. It's frightening because I've lost sight of balance, and I don't know if I can get it back. Men and women, you don't just live on a budget. You don't just apply the truths that I shared on Friday about your money to have more money or even to be able to give more. You do it so you can try to have balance on the left side of that diagram so you don't get to the end of your life and have built a financial house with no foundation of spiritual and social capital. So I just want you to understand there's three forms of capital. Now, I know some of you are looking down there. There's two blanks. You see Psalm 37 and Psalm 49. So here's the contrast we have. The contrast we have is between posterity, that's what Psalm 37 talks about, and prosperity, that's what Psalm 49 talks about. There's only a couple letters difference, but there's a huge difference in the meanings. Prosperity is what comes to mind when we think about the material trappings that come from somebody being prosperous. Posterity has to do with the generations, the legacy that comes after you. When I was writing the book, Your Life Well Spent, I thought about entitling it Prosperity versus Posterity. But everybody thinks posterity is your rear end, okay? So I thought that was not a good title. Posterity is not your rear end. Posterity is your legacy. And so the contrast we have and the decision we have to make is, are we going to focus on posterity, a godly legacy, or are we going to focus on the illusion of prosperity and miss it all? Psalm 49 is great because it talks about the fact that man builds buildings, he buys land, he puts his name on it, but it's not going to endure. Go read Psalm 49 sometime. It's just great because isn't that what we do? Even that business that has your name on it isn't the most important legacy that you're going to leave. The most important legacy you and I leave are those that we impact. First and foremost, our children, and then it's the other people we impact for God's kingdom. That's why what you're doing through the Jesus film is so impactful, because you're leaving a godly posterity. So that's what we're talking about here, is how do I balance life to focus on posterity versus prosperity? Well, here's what happens to us. The reason it's difficult to do that is we don't think correctly. And I'm going to just tell you very briefly 4 areas we don't think right in. And you see them right down there. The first one is we don't think right about our money. We don't think right about our money. And the first lie we believe is that money is a measure of self-worth. Money is a measure of self-worth. So, when somebody comes to your church, what's the first thing you ask them? What do you do? Where do you live? We start trying to stack people up social economically. Somehow that matters, that what you do, your vocation, and where you live and what you drive, that's somehow important to us because we've equated our self-worth to our financial net worth, and they're not equated. Those verses that are listed there for you, Proverbs 22 says, the rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of both of them. Ephesians 2:10, you're Christ's workmanship in Christ Jesus, created for good works, that you should walk in them. And then, of course, Deuteronomy 8, it says, you think it's your ability to make wealth. No, I, the Lord, have given you the ability to make wealth. So money cannot be the measurement because God has allowed some people to be poor and some people to be rich, and so that cannot be the measure of self-worth. That cannot be the measure. But when we start thinking it's the measure, then we start getting out of balance. We start working a little extra hours. We think, okay, I'm just going to make a little more, and we start focusing on our self-worth being tied to our net worth, and we get out of balance because we've bought that lie. You're worth an incredible amount whether you have money or not. Jesus Christ died on the cross for your sins and my sins if we were the only person in the world. So don't ever buy the lie that somehow your self-worth is tied to your net worth. Now, God has an interesting way of helping drive home points, right? So when I was working on the book years ago, Julie and I used to take the kids. How many of you vacation in Kansas? Anybody here vacation in Kansas? I don't see any hands, okay? Okay, I see one back there. So Julie and I, this is back in the early 90s, and we'd put the kids in the car, and we would say, hey, kids, we're going to see the grandparents in Kansas, and sometimes we'd go through Kansas and go on to Colorado and see the mountains and come back. And so we had this tradition or this thing in our family where when we started driving, I hated the interstates. I said, let's go on the 2-lane roads and see the countryside. Now, you can do that when you get west of the Mississippi. Back here, we tried to do it on the East Coast, and you don't get anywhere. So we get out there, and we get off the interstates, and the boys say, we want to eat at McDonald's, and we want to eat at all these places, and Pizza Hut. We said, hey, when you have your kids, you can do that, but we're gonna drive down these 2-lane roads, and we're going to eat at the local cafes. You know what I'm talking about, with the menu on the grease board, and there's a police cruiser out front, and when you walk in, they say you aren't from around here. So here's what happened. We'd be off on these 2-lane roads, driving across the countryside, and I began to observe something. You're driving down the road, and you get to the outskirts of this little town, and here's this big white house up on the hill, right? And a white fence around about 80 acres and Hereford cattle up on the hill. This is the guy that has the financial capital. He's got the net worth. He's probably the lawyer, the banker, the doctor, whatever in town. You got the visual in your mind, so you got the big house, the fence, the nice spread, and you keep driving along, and the houses get a little smaller, and pretty soon you go across the railroad tracks, and there's a bunch of double wides. And then you're out of town. 40 miles down the road, what happens? Come to another little town, same thing. The nice part of town, the guys have the financial capital, houses get smaller and smaller, double wides, and out of town. And then it dawned on me. The guy in the one town probably didn't even know the guy in the other town. Right? So he's pretty impressed with himself. He's built this financial capital, and he's got this financial net worth, and he feels pretty good about himself, but 30 miles down the road, there's somebody else in that town that has a financial capital. And that's when it dawned on me. And here's one I want to drive home. If you make it your life's ambition to amass financial capital and don't invest it in what God's doing, you may impact a limited sphere of people. How many people will ever know what you have financially? I don't know where you live or what you drive, so you're not impressing me. You're not impressing. You may have 100 people that know what you have, or 500 even, but whatever it is, it's a limited sphere of people. So if you make it your goal to invest in financial capital here, you'll impact a limited sphere of people. But if you invest in what God's doing around the world, you can impact an unlimited sphere of people. Isn't that neat? That's what I saw as I drove across the countryside. I can make it my goal to build financial capital and build net worth to try to impress a limited sphere of people. Or I can invest my money to impact an unlimited sphere of people that I won't even know this side of heaven. It's like Don said the other night, they'll be lined up, hopefully, to thank you. So don't ever buy the lie that you have to amass and you should pursue money to be worth something. And the next line there is you're wanting to fill it in. Life does not consist of our possessions. 1 Corinthians 4:7. What do you have that you weren't given in the first place? So the principle of limited sphere is very simple. And it's a choice each one of us in this room have to make. Am I going to make it my life's ambition to try to impress a few people where I live, whether it be on the West Coast or the North or wherever you live, or am I going to invest my money to impact an unlimited sphere of people? The second truth that we don't know about money is we think if we just had more money, we'd be content. Well, how'd that work for you as your income went up? You know, I usually ask people, do you make more now than you were making 20 years ago? And they say, yeah. And I say, are you content now? See, the interesting thing is, contentment has nothing to do with how much you make. It has to do with spending less than you make. I'll never forget how I learned this. I was out in California when I first started in the business, and I might have told you I don't know if I told you this when I started the other day, but when I started with Ron, I made the mistake of telling him how much I made teaching, and he said, well, that's what I'll pay you. And I said, well, Ron, that's 9 months. So I took a pay cut to come to work. So I was making $15,000 a year, and I had a client making 40 times that out in California. So if you could multiply, you know that was 600. But I was meeting with this gentleman, and he was spending 700. I remember coming back to Atlanta, walking in the apartment, put my arm around Julie and said, honey, I learned a very important lesson on this trip. Financial contentment has nothing to do with how much you make. It has to do with spending less than you make. And I know you're thinking, Russ, if I made 600, I'd never spend more than that. That's not true. Here's another truth. If you don't learn to spend less than you make where you are, help your kids and grandkids understand this, then you will always spend a little bit more no matter how much you make. So we were spending $14,999, okay? So we were spending less than we made, but you just have to learn it and then carry that on through. So I love this story when it comes to talking about contentment. There was an American businessman at the pier of a small coastal Mexican village when a small boat with just one fisherman docked. Inside the small boat were several large yellowfin tuna, and the American complimented the Mexican on the quality of his fish and asked him how long it took him to catch, and the Mexican replied, only a little while. The American asked, well, why didn't he stay out there longer and catch more fish? The Mexican said that he had enough to support the immediate needs of his family. The American asked, well, what do you do with the rest of your time? The Mexican fisherman said, I sleep late, I play with my children, I take a siesta with my wife Maria, I stroll into the village each evening, and I sip wine and play guitar with my amigos. I have a full, busy life, senor. The American scoffed, I'm a Harvard MBA and I can help you. You should spend more time fishing. With the proceeds, buy a bigger boat. And with the proceeds from the bigger boat, you could buy several boats, and eventually you would have a fleet of fishing boats. Instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you would sell directly to the processor, eventually opening your own cannery. You would control the product, processing, and distribution. You need to leave this small coastal fishing village and move to Mexico City and then to LA, eventually New York City, where you could run your expanding enterprise. Mexican fisherman asked, Senor, how long will all of this take? American replied, 15 to 20 years. But then what, senor? American laughed and said, that's the best part. When the time is right, you'd announce an IPO, sell your company stock to the public, and become very rich. You'd make millions, senor. Well, then what, senor? The American said, then you could retire, move to a small coastal fishing village where you could sleep late, fish a little, play with your kids. You know, look at that diagram at the top of the page. Here's the big idea. We need to enjoy the trip. Help your kids and grandkids understand this. I've seen it, okay? I've worked with guys that have done that. It's kind of like that Cats in the Cradle song. Remember that? You know, the boy wants his dad to play catch, but he doesn't have time. Then when he finally has time, he doesn't want to play catch. We laugh at that story, but unfortunately, we bought the lie of the world that, hey, the bigger my net worth, the better. The guy with the most toys wins, and we're rushing through our lives. And like I said earlier, our children lay wounded on the ground, run over by high-speed good intentions. Our relationships are being starved to death by velocity because we don't think right about money. We've bought this American ideal that more, quicker. And I'm not going to talk much about retirement. You see it there at the bottom. The thing you can fill in that blank. The thing about retirement is it's causing us to hurry to quit. Let's just don't do that. I'm not necessarily against retirement. I'm a financial guy, but the point is, for young couples, you and I see it all the time. They're trying to educate their kids. They're trying to start their families. They're trying to, pay off their mortgages. They're trying to do all that, and then they're also thinking they got to fund retirement, and they're stressed. The big idea is enjoy the trip. Extend your time horizon. Learn to be content. More money will not make you content. Contentment comes from the process, not the product. And finally, money is not a measure of success. See, we have people come to our church and we ask them what they do, and we immediately in our minds conclude that they're successful or they're not. When have you used the word success as an adjective with the UPS guy that comes down and delivers stuff at your house? Have you used it with the butcher behind the counter at the grocery store? See, we've equated success with monetary trappings. And our language betrays us. I want you to think the next time you use the word success as it comes across your lips, you'll probably find that it wasn't used in God's definition. Joshua 1:8 says, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night and be careful to do according to all that is written in it. And then your way will be prosperous, and everything you do, you'll have success." I used to read that and think, I'm going to do what's in it, I'm going to have money. That's just like most of you. I thought, okay, said it right there in Joshua, right? If I do what's written in here, then I'm going to be prosperous and successful. But what does God's word say is real success? Colossians 3:23, if you work heartily for your employer as unto the Lord, you're successful. Men, if you love your wives as Christ loved the church, you're successful. If you teach your children as you walk by the way, as you rise up and as you lie down, as it says back in Daniel, you're successful. I don't care if you have money. Why don't you try the next time you see a young couple come to your church and they're struggling, but they're doing a good job in their marriage and they're doing a good job with their family, why don't you walk up and say, man, I really appreciate how successful you are in what really matters. You see the difference? So I was writing on this years ago, and I just written the first book back in 1989, and I was overseeing a client in Alabama. And on the way out of town, I saw a Christian bookstore. So I went in the bookstore and asked them if they had the book, and they said no, they'd never heard of it. And then I was driving back to Atlanta and drove to another little town and driving down to Main Street, and I saw another bookstore, so I whipped in and went in the store and said, do you have this book? And they said, no, never heard of it. And I walked out, and it's like God tapped me on the shoulder and said, Russ, what are you going to do? Go in every bookstore in America and see if they have your book? Now, why did I care? Because the definition of success with books is what? Sales. But in God's definition, I was successful when I completed what He put on my heart to do, whether it sold one or the two that it sold. That's when I was successful. You see the difference? We need to call success what God calls success. And it has nothing to do with money. If you look on the back of your sheet there, you see the difference. You can be successful and prosperous and not have money. See, those are comparative, and they have to do with successfully accomplishing a goal. Wealth and riches have to do with money. So somebody can be richer than somebody else, somebody can be wealthier than somebody else, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're successful or prosperous. You understand the difference? Now, you can have money and be successful and prosperous, but you can not have money and be successful and prosperous. And I just think I want to challenge us to think right, because we have bought the idea that you're only successful as it equates to how much money you have and how much you make and what kind of vocation you're in, and that is absolutely not true. You're successful, as it says back in Joshua, as you do according to all that is written in here, and has to do with relationships primarily, and how you go about work and so forth. So, think right about your money. It's not a measure of self-worth. It's not a guarantee of contentment. It's not a measure of success. And if we start thinking right about that, I think we have a chance to slow down the pace of life and try to have some balance and not get to the end of our life and have any regrets. I would say to us, we need to measure wealth by the things we have that we would not take money for. Measure wealth by the things you have that you would not take money for. And remember this, children are the living messages you send to a time you will not see. That's the legacy you ultimately, that's the mark you leave. Children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see. Now, let me just give you one thing about kids, because I've been talking about kids. Resist the urge to give them all the things that you didn't have. Children need to be productive and content, not consumptive. You know, we need to think about our kids, but, you know, there's a time that I should spend money maybe for the yard help so I can spend time with them when they're little, but then as they get older, I should quit doing that and let them do it to learn a work ethic. But I see many people that they say, I don't want my kids to have it like I had it. I wanted my boys to have it like I had. I grew up on a farm in Kansas. We didn't have anything, had to learn to work. See, here's the thing. If you have money, sometimes it's harder to teach your kids work ethic than if you don't have money. So you have to be pretty shrewd and wise about how, if you have wealth, how do you help your kids learn the very things that you had to learn that help you build the character that you build? That's why money is not necessarily all it's cracked up to be, especially if you have too much of it. Should I have it? I had a girl one time call me and says, Russ, I'm scared to death. I'm 20 and a half years old. I'm turning 21, and I'm the recipient of these trust funds. When I turn 21, I'm getting married in a year, and I don't want to have happen what I saw happen to my mother and grandmother. What she's saying was she had watched the money as it come down through this. And if I told you the name of the family, you'd know it. And she was like a third or fourth generation, and she had the foresight to realize what it could potentially do to her marriage. So what we did was we designed a plan where they lived off his income so he could feel good about himself and gave away the rest. Teach your sons and daughters to be productive and content, not consumptive. Because if you teach them to be consumptive, you're setting them up for failure either way. In other words, what if your son's called to do something that doesn't make the income you make? He needs to be willing to live within that. I'm forever grateful to Julie's parents. She grew up in a doctor's family, and when I met her, she thought everybody had private airplanes because her folks had an airplane and drove Cadillacs and stuff. And I was a school teacher making $9,000 at the time, but her folks did a good job of helping her understand this is our stuff, not your stuff. Don't get used to it. And you may marry a guy that's not going to make that much money. And so the idea is that you want your daughters and granddaughters and your sons and grandsons to be productive and content and be able to be obedient to what God has called them to do, regardless of the income, and learn to live within that. Yeah, the rest of the story on Julie was when I asked her to marry me, she said no, she didn't want to be poor. But God wrestled with her, and she wrestled with God for 4 nights and called me back on Thursday and said, yes, that was great. And wrestled through this whole idea of fitting in and being willing to live on less than what she thought she wanted to. But that's because of some of the upbringing she had had. So teach your children to be productive and content, not consumptive, and then they'll be free to follow God's lead in their life and do whatever, whether it be a missionary, a teacher, doctor, business person, anything like that. So the big idea I wanted to get across this morning is that we got to think right about our money. Money fits right in the center of our lives. We have to deal with it. We have to buy braces, and we have to, pay college. We have to deal with it. But let's remember why we're dealing with it. It's not to have more financial capital at the expense of social and spiritual capital. We're dealing with our money to try to get balance in our life so we can enjoy the trip. And so we don't get to the end of our life and have any regrets. And to help people realize that true success and true worth comes from who Christ says I am, and it comes from obedience to this. And it may involve money and it may not. But it's time that we changed our vernacular and quit equating success simply with the material trappings. I think when we start thinking better, we'll start living better. Yeah, and you'll look different, you'll look different than your neighbors maybe, or your peers. Maybe you won't send your kids or grandkids to the most, prestigious colleges. But you're going to say, hey, I'm going to apply these principles. I'm going to apply these truths. And I'm just here to tell you that I've seen this work because I've seen the right side of that diagram too many times. So I appeal to you to help your children and grandchildren, because I know this is an older crowd. Don't buy the lie. Don't let them rush through their 20s, 30s, and 40s and build the business and then turn around and say, all right, kids, I want to play catch. Enjoy the trip. And remember, at the end of the day, only a few people know what you're going to have financially anyway. So I'd rather give it away and impact an unlimited sphere of people. And I'll get a report card on that in heaven.